So there are fun and interesting dynamics everywhere that you go in this world. No matter where you go, you can usually figure out which group of people thinks that they're better than any other group of people around them, right? We can do this. Like in Edmonton, there's this sense that people south of the river are better than those north of the river, unless you live on the north side of the river, right? Like Amy and I had been here, I think, 2 months before I got that sense of it. And then there's that dynamic between Millwoods and the rest of Edmonton, I forget where I saw this, but it was an old news article, I think from the mid-'80s, but I didn't pay attention to the date. And it was when Millwoods was still sort of a newer neighborhood. And they're like, what do people think of Millwoods, this new experimental design of a neighborhood in Edmonton? And it was the vast majority of the folks that lived in Millwoods loved it. The vast majority of folks that lived outside of Millwoods didn't like it. And there wasn't much in between. And I'll be honest, to this day, we still hear comments about people not wanting to come to Millwoods if they live outside of it, right? Like, I've been here 5 years. I'm still not used to the fact that avenues become streets and the numbers change. Like back home, you might have one road that does this number, but it's the same name. It has no logic to it aside from maybe following a creek, but it's different here. And then there's that contention, if we want to step back a little bit more, between Edmonton and Calgary. Even if you take the hockey stuff out of it, there would still be a little tension between these two cities, right? I mean, one's bigger, one's the capital. There's going to be some tension. Everyone in Calgary thinks Calgary is better, or Calgary. How are you supposed to say it? Calgary. All right, I've heard like 5 different ways of pronouncing that city. Like everyone in Calgary thinks Calgary is better, and everyone in Edmonton thinks Edmonton is better, right? And we know that Edmonton is the better of the two because, yeah. We apologize for our near Calgarian peoples. Sorry. And then we throw in hockey, and that just gets blown out of the water. I'm sure you people, and I know you're out there that keep up with the stats, can point to the stats and say definitively, this is why the Oilers are better. And I'll bet you there's a Calgary Flames fan out there. They'll do the exact same thing. You're just looking at different stats. I still contend that the two should never meet because oil and fire are not a good combination. Just saying. And like I said, this is true everywhere. Like back home, we have deep divisions between Eastern-style barbecue and Lexington-style barbecue folks. If you've come to a cookout at my house, you know this. Amy and I are on different sides of that debate, and all of you have said they taste the same. And we're like, no, they don't. And that doesn't even get into, like, in North Carolina, we don't even mention that weird thing they do to their barbecue in South Carolina. We don't even mention it. It's weird. You don't do that. And we might disagree about what kind of sauce you put on your barbecue in North Carolina, but when somebody starts talking about barbecue and they reference like Texas or Kansas or anywhere else in the world, we all band together because we know our barbecue is the best. It's just, what kind of sauce do you put on it? Like, if you're talking about barbecue and it's not even pork, it's not barbecue. I'm sorry. All of this is good-natured and fun. It can be serious. And we could, or actually do debate this all day, every day. Like, you get me down to somebody that's passionate about Lexington-style barbecue, and we'll go back and forth for hours to everyone else getting nauseous about it. But we all know that the moment it becomes personal, the moment that it becomes an actual attack and not just heckling each other, when it goes beyond that, we know that we've crossed the line. That we've veered off course. We know that we're doing it wrong when that happens. Yes, Edmontonians and Calgarians may not get along, but we shouldn't take that too seriously. Or there might be some tension there, but we shouldn't take it too seriously. And even though we recognize that there are innumerable ways that we are different from each other deep down, because we can heckle each other about these differences, we know deep down that no one is better or worse, more or less human than another. This is just how we make light of things and jest with each other. And I think that helps us get into this parable that Jesus told about a landowner hiring workers all through the day, promising to pay them whatever is right. The first group, he promised to pay them a denarius, which was the right thing to do for a day's labor. But everyone else, I'll pay you whatever is right. He pays them all a denarius, enough for them to support their family for one day. The language that we use for that now in the 21st century in the English-speaking world is a living wage. He paid them all a living wage, regardless of how long they had worked. And some of them thought and shouted out, "It seems like that's not fair. We were hired to work first thing in the morning, and we worked all day. We should be paid more. We think we deserve more than those who worked just a few hours." And they're upset about it. And the owner tells them, "I paid you a sufficient wage for the day. Why are you mad that I choose to be generous?" Thing is, we might think that those who worked all day should receive more pay than those who worked less. We think the same way as those hired early in the morning. That's how we've all been conditioned to think. It's hard for most of us to agree that they should all receive the same living wage for the day, regardless of how much effort they put in. It does not seem fair. And this might be overly blunt, but maybe that's the point. Maybe the point of this parable is that the kingdom of heaven is not fair. I appreciate that right there. Just went, All right, confused puppy dog looks are good. The kingdom of heaven is not fair. How many of y'all were expecting to hear that this morning? Good. No one raised their hand. You see, fairness is based off of status. And Jesus is quite clear that status does not mean anything in the kingdom of heaven. The story immediately preceding this parable is when the rich man came to Jesus asking, "What must I do to inherit an eternal life?" And he left that conversation sad because Jesus told him, "Sell everything you own and give the money to the poor." We don't know if he did that or not. We just know that he walked away sad. And that's when Jesus utters those well-known words that we try to soften so much. It's easier for a camel to squeeze through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter God's kingdom. We've tried to soften that by saying it's a metaphor. There was a tiny gate in the walls of Jerusalem. That's a made-up story. There's no evidence for such a gate ever existing. Jesus is literally talking about the difficulty a camel would have going through the eye of a sewing needle here. Status doesn't matter. The disciples asked themselves, can we get into the kingdom of heaven? Can we? After all, we've been with Jesus. We've been with you since the very beginning. We left everything to follow you. Surely their status as disciples from the get-go, before anyone knew who Jesus was, surely that status means something. And Jesus tells them, many who are first will be last, and many who are last will be first. Status and standing do not matter in the kingdom of heaven. And that is what happens immediately before Jesus jumps into this parable about these workers being paid the same wage, even though they work different hours. And after this parable, just to go a little bit further, Jesus talks about his death and resurrection. Very next thing he does. And then the mother of James and John asks that her kids sit at his right and his left hand when he comes into his glory. Sort of missing the point of, hi, I'm going to be crucified. Do you really want your kids sitting at my right and left hand on crosses? There's a little disconnect there. But again, the disciples, they don't pick up on this. Because the rest of them get jealous because, wait, the 10 of us, we're all in this together. Why are those two going to get out? They ought not do that. And Jesus tells them once again that status and standing do not matter. He says, "You know that those who rule the Gentiles show off their authority over them, and their high-ranking officials order them around. But that's not the way it will be with you. Whoever wants to be great among you will be your servant. Whoever wants to be first among you will be your slave. Just as the human one did not come to be served, but rather to serve and give his life to liberate many people." Status does not matter, in other words. It only matters that you serve each other and liberate each other. And yet we still cry out, "That's not fair." And while it's true that life is not fair, I think we can all agree with that. That does not mean that we need to be fair either. I love your facial expressions right now. We know a lot of people are struggling to find work, and that there's a lot of people who do have work who are adding side gigs and second jobs just to make ends meet. What's fair about that? I was just talking to one of our members this morning, and they shared that someone in their family is working 6 days a week, 12 hours a day. What's fair about that? What's fair about a single parent having to work multiple jobs and the kids never seeing them, and the kids don't understand why? They just know that mom or dad doesn't show up when I need them because they're always at work. That's heartbreaking. More pointedly, what's fair about all of us being okay with that? With as prevalent as it is. That's the fairness that these workers who were hired at the beginning of the day expect from the landowner. They say, "We contributed all day, so we should receive more than they did because they didn't work all day." That's fair. But what's fair about these other workers going home without enough to support them and their families and doing without? What's fair about asking them to choose between shelter and food, or in our day, medicine? What's fair about asking them to go back to their families with less than they need to simply survive? The workers hired at the beginning of the day think they have more status because they worked longer, but from the perspective of the kingdom of God, they don't. And because we live in a capitalist society, we might want to blame the other workers and say, well, it's their fault that they weren't hired at the beginning of the day, but that's a lot of assumptions. We have no idea at all why they weren't hired. Any reason that we can think of is pure speculation. The parable does not tell us. It's just as likely that as they were walking to the market to get hired for the day, a Roman soldier said, "Hey, here's my bag, carry it for a mile," which they were legally obligated to do. Just as likely as that to happen as that they were lazy. It's possible that their child was sick all night and they spent the morning at the doctor's office. How many of y'all have done that? Maybe it's a parable, so let's be a little bit fast and loose with the time frame here. Maybe their car broke down a couple days ago and they had to go pick it up at the shop. And they got to the shop first thing in the morning. Maybe they're taking care of an aging parent and they don't have enough help. Or maybe they were at the market and no one hired them first thing because they didn't look the part, whatever the part needed to be for them to be hired. Maybe they had no experience, or maybe, like my generation found out the hard way, you're overqualified and entry-level positions are not for you because you've got a 4-year degree and a master's degree. This is an entry-level position. You're too qualified. You can't get it. So many of my friends went through that experience. Maybe they lived with a disability and no one was interested in making reasonable accommodations. Maybe they were lazy. We don't know. We need to recognize that the reason they were not hired first thing in the morning does not matter to Jesus as he tells this parable. We don't know why they were not hired at the beginning of the day, but what we do know is that the owner in this parable hired them as soon as he found them. As soon as he found people, he's like, hey, go work in the field today. Go work in the vineyard. Go. As soon as he finds them. What we do know is that they need to eat and have shelter from the elements. We know that they are loved children of God, and that the degree and depth of God's love for them does not change based on when they were hired during the day or if they were hired at all. Instead of focusing on what is fair, Jesus tells this parable to teach us and his disciples to ask not what is fair, not what do I deserve, but how can I serve? How can I help my neighbor? How can I be like that owner and be generous? That's the call of this parable. Status does not matter in the kingdom of heaven. What does matter is how we are able to be generous with each other. So when you're in a position where your cup is overflowing, that beautiful image from the 23rd Psalm, when you are experiencing that, how are you finding ways to funnel your overabundance, your overflowing goodness, to people whose cups are not full, or maybe even don't even have cups? And when you see someone being generous, celebrate that generosity. Celebrate that goodness. And resist the temptation to cry, that's not fair, because the kingdom of heaven is not about fairness. The kingdom of heaven is a landowner who gives generously so that no one lacks what they need. The kingdom of heaven is working together so that the last will be first. The kingdom of heaven is working collectively towards sharing the overflowing abundance of God in this beautiful and generous world. The kingdom of heaven is making sure that everyone has enough.